A man sits at a machine covered in switches. The last switch is labeled 450 volts. Beneath it, 3 letters, XXX. From the next room, a voice has been screaming, begging, pounding on the wall, and then nothing. Silence. The man hesitates. His hands are shaking. He is sweating through his shirt. A calm voice behind him says 4 words. The experiment requires that you continue, and he reaches out, and he presses the switch. He is not a monster. He is a schoolteacher, an engineer, your neighbor. He is an ordinary person. And 2 out of 3 ordinary people will press that switch all the way to the end. This is the most disturbing experiment in the history of psychology, and the truth about it is stranger than the experiment itself. In 1961, the world was still trying to understand the Holocaust. 6 million people murdered, not by a handful of madmen, but by thousands of ordinary clerks, soldiers, and citizens who said, again and again, I was only following orders. A young psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram had a question that would not let him sleep. Were those people fundamentally different from us? Some special breed of evil? Or, and this was the terrifying possibility, would almost anyone do the same, under the right conditions? There was only one way to find out. You couldn't ask people. People lie, especially to themselves. You had to put ordinary Americans in a room, hand them the power to hurt someone, and watch what they actually did. The advertisement ran in a New Haven newspaper. A study of memory and learning, it said. 1 hour of your time, $4.50. The volunteers came from everywhere. Teachers, salesmen, postal workers, engineers, ordinary people, everyone. When a volunteer arrived, he met 2 others, a stern man in a gray lab coat, the experimenter, and a soft, friendly, middle-aged man, the other volunteer. They drew slips of paper to decide their roles, teacher or learner. The draw was rigged. The real volunteer always became the teacher. The friendly man was an actor, and he always became the learner. The teacher watched as the learner was led into a room, strapped into a chair, and wired with electrodes. The learner mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a heart condition. Then the teacher was taken next door and seated in front of a machine. 30 switches in a long row. 15 volts, 30, 45. Climbing all the way to 450. The labels grew darker as the numbers rose. Slight shock, moderate, strong, intense. Danger, severe shock. And at the very end, simply XXX. The rule was simple. Every time the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher would deliver a shock. And with every wrong answer, the teacher would move 1 switch higher. At first, it was almost easy. 15 volts, 30, a mild buzz. The learner got some answers right, some wrong, but the wrong answers added up, and the voltage climbed. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150, he demanded to be let out. He said his heart was bothering him. He refused to go on. And here is where the experiment really began. Because the teacher, sweating now, would turn to the man in the gray coat and ask, "Should I stop?" The experimenter never raised his voice. He never threatened. He simply delivered a line. "Please continue." At 200 volts, the learner was screaming. At 300, he pounded on the wall and begged for his life. And the experimenter said, "The experiment requires that you continue." Then, past 330 volts, the learner went silent. No answers, no screams, nothing. For all the teacher knew, the man next door was unconscious, or worse. And still, the calm voice continued. "It is absolutely essential that you continue." You have no other choice. You must go on. Before he ran the experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists to predict the outcome. They were confident. Only a tiny fraction of people, maybe 1 in 1,000, the truly disturbed would go all the way to 450 volts. Americans, they said, simply don't do that. They were catastrophically wrong. In the first and most famous version of the experiment, 65% of ordinary people pushed every single switch. All the way to the end, all the way to XXX, not because they were cruel. That is the part that haunts. They didn't enjoy it. They trembled. They sweated. They laughed in horror. They argued. They protested. They begged the experimenter to check on the man next door. And then they obeyed anyway. Good people, decent people, hurting a stranger to death because a man in a coat told them to. How? How does a normal person end up pressing that final switch? The answer is not that they became monsters. The answer is far more unsettling. They stopped feeling responsible. Milgram called it the agentic state. The moment you decide you are just the instrument, that the person in charge owns the consequences, something inside you switches off. It happens in small steps. 15 volts is nothing, and if 15 was okay, why not 30? Each switch is only one small step worse than the last. By the time you reach the screaming, you are already deep in, and turning back means admitting every switch before it was wrong. And the authority does the rest. The gray coat, the clipboard, the calm, certain voice. We are trained from birth to trust the person who seems to be in charge, the doctor, the officer, the expert. Milgram ran the study again and again, changing one thing at a time, and what he found mapped the exact shape of our obedience. When the learner was in the same room, close enough to touch, obedience dropped. When the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped further. When the experimenter gave his orders by telephone instead of in person, obedience collapsed. Distance from the victim made cruelty easy. Distance from the authority made it hard. We are not wired to be cruel. We are wired to obey. And those are not the same thing, but they kill the same way. Milgram's findings detonated across the world. Here, it seemed, was the answer to the Holocaust. Not a nation of monsters, a nation of ordinary people in an agentic state, each one a small instrument of a machine that no single person felt responsible for. The philosopher Hannah Arendt had a phrase for it, watching the trial of the Nazi bureaucrat Adolf Eichmann, the banality of evil. Evil done not by demons, but by unremarkable people who simply did their jobs and did not think. For 50 years, Milgram's experiment became the proof. It appears in every psychology textbook. It is one of the most cited studies ever conducted. The lesson was clear and final. Under the right conditions, almost anyone can be made to do almost anything. Except, the story you were just told is the clean version. And decades later, when a writer named Gina went into Milgram's own archives at Yale, she found the experiment was far messier than the textbooks admit. Start with the famous number, 65%. That came from one specific version of the experiment. Milgram ran more than 20 variations, and in many of them, obedience was far lower. The single most obedient condition became the headline. The rest were quietly left in the shadows. Then there were the 4 prods. The calm, scripted lines. The archive recordings tell a different story. Experimenters went off script, improvising, pressuring, bullying, some participants far beyond 4 polite sentences, sometimes pushing a dozen times or more. And the participants themselves? Many of them, it turned out, didn't believe the shocks were real. They suspected the whole thing was staged. And if you don't believe you're hurting anyone, you aren't really obeying. You're playing along. And the promise that everyone was gently debriefed, told the truth right away, reassured. For many, that never happened. Some went home believing for months that they had nearly killed a man. The experiment that taught the world about obedience was, itself, built on a story that bent the truth to make a cleaner point. So was it all a lie? No. And this is the part that should keep you up at night. Because when careful scientists stripped away Milgram's exaggerations and ran the experiment again, more ethically, more honestly, in 2009, and again in Poland in 2017, people still obeyed. Not 65%, perhaps, but far, far more than any of us would like to believe. The clean number was a myth. The uncomfortable truth underneath it was not. Milgram oversold his evidence, but he did not invent the thing he was pointing at. We really will follow the calm voice. We really will keep pressing the switch. So here's the question, the real one. Not, would those people press the switch? They already did. The question is whether you would, sitting there, sweating. The screaming stopped, the calm voice behind you saying the experiment requires that you continue. You would like to believe you are the 1 in 3 who stands up and walks out. Almost everyone believes that. Almost everyone is wrong. Because the man at the machine was not a monster. He was a school teacher, an engineer, your neighbor. He was an ordinary person. And somewhere right now, a calm voice is reading someone their prods, and they are reaching for the switch.